For 50 years, my body bled with the same wounds of Christ. People traveled from every corner of the world just to see them with their own eyes. Some believed it was a miracle. Others insisted it had to be a deception. But the truth is, my story did not begin with blood on my hands. It began many years earlier, when I was only a child in a small village in Italy, and someone began visiting me in the silence of the night. My name is Padre Pio of Pietrelcina, although when I was born my parents named me Francesco Forgione. I came into the world on May 25, 1887, in Pietrelcina, a quiet farming village where life was simple, work was hard, and faith was part of everyday life. My parents, Grazio, Mario Forgione, and Maria Giuseppa D'Annunzio, were humble people who worked tirelessly to support our family. We did not have wealth or comfort, but we had something far more valuable: deep faith in God. In our home, the rosary was prayed daily, and trust in God's providence was as natural as breathing. Yet even as a small child, my life began to unfold differently from that of the other children in the village. When I was about 5 years old, something extraordinary started to happen. While other children were playing in the fields or running through the narrow streets of Pietrelcina, I began seeing things they could not see. At times, I saw Jesus Christ. At other moments, I saw the Virgin Mary. And very often I sensed the presence of my guardian angel, who seemed to accompany me and guide me even when I was alone. To me, these experiences felt natural, almost as if heaven was closer to the earth than most people realized. But not every presence was filled with light. Some nights brought shadows, dark figures that appeared suddenly, as if emerging from the corners of the room, trying to frighten me and disturb my peace. I was only a child and could not understand why these things were happening. But I quickly discovered something that would stay with me for the rest of my life. Whenever I prayed, those shadows disappeared. Prayer became my refuge long before I fully understood the spiritual battle that had already begun around me. As the years passed, a deep desire grew inside my heart. I wanted to give my life completely to God. I wanted to become a priest. It was not a childish dream or a passing thought. It was a calling that burned within me. But for my family, this dream seemed almost impossible. We were poor, and education required money we simply did not have. That was when my father made a sacrifice I would never forget. He left home for a time and traveled far away to work, determined to earn enough money so I could study and follow the path God had placed in my heart. His sacrifice became a silent promise I carried with me. If God was truly calling me, I would give him everything. When I was 15 years old, that calling finally became reality. I entered the novitiate of the Order of Friars Minor Capuchin in Morcone. It was there that my life changed forever. I left behind the name Francesco and received the name by which the world would later know me, Pio, inspired by Pope Pius V. From that moment forward, my life belonged entirely to God. Yet the path of religious life did not begin with peace. From the very first months in the monastery, my health began to fail in ways that puzzled everyone around me. I suffered from intense fevers, mysterious pains, and an exhaustion that seemed to come from nowhere. Doctors examined me again and again, but none could clearly explain what was happening. Many believed my body was simply too weak for the demanding life of a friar. But the truth was something medicine could not explain. The nights had grown darker. The same dark presences that had appeared during my childhood began returning with greater force. Sometimes in the middle of the night, I felt real blows, as if invisible hands were striking me. Other times it felt as though something was dragging me from my bed or shaking the furniture in my small cell. When morning came, the other friars occasionally found my room in disarray and my body bruised as though I had been in a struggle. What I was experiencing was not imagination. It was a spiritual battle, and it seemed to grow stronger the more I dedicated myself to God. But instead of breaking my faith, those trials strengthened it. I came to understand something important. The enemy does not attack what he does not fear. If the darkness fought so fiercely, it was because God had a purpose for my life that I could not yet see. In 1910, I was finally ordained as a priest. I remember that day as if heaven itself had drawn near. When I celebrated my first Mass and spoke the words of consecration, something profound happened within my soul. It felt as though the sacrifice of Christ on the cross was not simply a memory, but a living reality unfolding before me. From that day forward, every Mass became for me a deeply personal encounter with the mystery of the cross. A few years later, in 1916, I was sent to a small monastery in San Giovanni Rotondo. a remote town high in the mountains. At that time it seemed like a quiet assignment, far from the attention of the world. No one could have imagined that this little monastery would one day become one of the most visited pilgrimage sites on earth. I certainly did not know it. My days were simple: prayer, mass, and hearing confessions. But God was preparing something that would change my life forever. One morning in 1918, after celebrating mass, I remained alone in the chapel to pray. The room was completely silent, the kind of silence that makes you feel as if time itself has stopped. As I knelt before the crucifix, a brilliant light suddenly filled the chapel. It did not come from outside, it seemed to radiate from the crucifix itself. In that moment, an intense pain pierced my hands, my feet, and my side. A pain so deep that it felt as though fire had entered my body. Slowly, I lowered my gaze, and what I saw left no doubt in my heart. Blood was beginning to flow from my hands. My feet were wounded as well, and my side burned with a mysterious wound. In that moment, I understood what God had allowed to happen. I had received the stigmata, the same wounds of Jesus Christ. Those wounds would not disappear the next day. They would not vanish the following week. They would remain on my body for 50 years. And when word of them began to spread, people started traveling from all over the world to see the priest who carried the wounds of Christ. Some came with faith, others came with doubts. Some believed they were witnessing a miracle, while others were determined to prove it could not possibly be true. But while the world began debating whether those wounds were real, the battles I was facing in secret were only beginning to grow more intense. The same dark forces that had tormented me in my youth had not disappeared. In fact, they were preparing for something far more violent. And what would happen in the years that followed would bring thousands of people to San Giovanni Rotondo, searching for answers to mysteries no one could explain, miracles, confessions that revealed hidden sins, and nights when the forces of darkness returned to fight inside my own cell. The day the wounds appeared on my hands, my life changed forever. Word began to spread beyond the small mountain town of San Giovanni. At first it was only whispers among villagers, then rumors among priests, and soon people from distant cities began arriving at the monastery gates. They came with questions in their hearts and hope in their eyes. Some wanted proof that God still worked miracles. Others came because they were desperate, broken, or burdened by sins they had carried for years. But the more people came searching for God, the more fiercely the darkness fought back. Many nights, after the monastery had fallen silent and the other friars were asleep, the attacks would begin. I often woke to the sound of violent blows against my door, or the feeling of an unseen force striking my body. At times the assaults were so real that when morning came, my brothers would find my room in chaos and my body bruised and exhausted. These were not dreams. They were battles, fierce and relentless. Later I would tell people something very simple: the devil is real, and he hates when a soul turns back to God. Yet even in the midst of those nights of struggle, something extraordinary was happening during the day. The confessional in the monastery began filling with people from early morning until late at night. At first there were a few, then dozens, then hundreds. Eventually, lines formed before sunrise. Many times I spent 10, even 15 hours a day hearing confessions. People often wondered how I could endure it, but what they did not know was that during those confessions, God sometimes allowed me to see into the souls of those who came before me, not to shame them but to bring them back to the truth. There were moments when someone would kneel before me and begin their confession, and before they finished speaking, I would gently ask them about sins they had not yet mentioned. They would look up in shock, their eyes wide with disbelief. Some would begin to tremble. "How did you know?" they would ask. The answer was always the same: I did not know, but God did. Those moments were not meant to frighten anyone. They were moments of mercy. Many people who had stayed away from confession for decades finally returned to God because of those encounters. But the mysteries surrounding my life did not stop there. There were times when people claimed they had seen me in places where I had never physically traveled. Soldiers during wartime said that a friar appeared to them on the battlefield, warning them of danger and saving their lives. Pilots reported seeing a monk in the sky standing before their aircraft, forcing them to turn away from bombing a town. Later they would come to the monastery, look at my face, and turn pale. "That was him," they would whisper. They believed they had seen me. The church would later call this phenomenon bilocation, the the mysterious ability granted by God to be present in more than one place at the same time. I never sought such things, and I never tried to explain them. All I knew was that God sometimes acts in ways beyond human understanding. But the miracles did not end with those strange appearances. One day a woman arrived carrying her sick child. The doctors had already given up hope. She begged me to pray for him. I simply placed my hand gently upon the child's head and prayed to Jesus Christ with all the faith in my heart. Days later, the child recovered completely. Stories like this began spreading quickly. People spoke of healings, of prayers answered, of impossible recoveries that doctors could not explain. Soon the small monastery was overwhelmed by the crowds. Thousands of pilgrims were traveling to San Giovanni Rotondo, hoping to see the priest with the wounds of Christ. But with fame came suspicion. Not everyone believed what was happening was from God. Some doctors examined my wounds, trying to determine whether they were natural or self-inflicted. Others accused me of deception, claiming the entire phenomenon must be a fraud. Reports were sent to the Vatican, and investigations began. At one point, the Church even placed restrictions on my ministry. I was forbidden to publicly celebrate Mass and limited in my ability to hear confessions. For someone whose entire life revolved around bringing souls closer to God, those restrictions were a heavy cross to carry. Yet I accepted them in silence, because obedience was more important than defending myself. Years passed, and eventually those restrictions were lifted. The investigations continued, but the Church slowly began to recognize that something extraordinary was truly happening. The wounds remained on my body year after year, bleeding but never becoming infected, something doctors struggled to explain. Still, the greatest miracle I ever witnessed was not the healings, it was the conversion of hearts. I saw hardened sinners return to God after decades. I saw people arrive burdened with despair and leave with peace in their souls. That was the real work God had entrusted to me. But while thousands of people were finding hope, something else was approaching, something darker. Because the closer my life moved toward its final years, the more violent the spiritual battles became. The attacks at night grew stronger, and the physical suffering in my body increased. And yet, there was another mystery that no one could explain. The wounds that had bled on my hands and feet for 50 years were about to disappear. Not slowly, not gradually, but suddenly, in a way that would leave doctors, priests, and believers completely stunned. For decades, the wounds on my hands, my feet, and my side had bled every day. Doctors had examined them. Pilgrims had seen them. Believers called them a miracle. Skeptics searched for explanations. Yet, through all those years, the wounds never became infected, never healed, and never disappeared. They remained there, silent witnesses to the suffering of Jesus Christ. But as the years passed, my body began to grow weaker. The long hours in the confessional, the constant crowds, the spiritual battles, and the physical pain slowly took their toll. By the late 1960s, I knew my time on this earth was approaching its end. Yet even in those final years, the monastery in San Giovanni Rotondo was more crowded than ever. Thousands of people continued to arrive every day. Some traveled for days just to attend one Mass. Others waited for hours simply to see me for a moment, hoping for a blessing, a word of encouragement, or a prayer. Many people expected spectacular miracles, but the truth is, the greatest miracle I ever witnessed was something much quieter, a soul returning to God. I saw men who had not confessed their sins in 40 years fall to their knees in tears. I saw families broken by anger find peace again. I saw people who had lost all hope rediscover faith. That was always the true purpose of my life. But something extraordinary was about to happen, something that would leave even the doctors speechless. In September of 1968, after 50 years of bleeding wounds, something began to change. The stigmata started to fade. At first, it was almost impossible to notice. The wounds that had once been deep and painful slowly became lighter, as if the suffering itself was being lifted away. Within days, something incredible happened. The wounds disappeared completely. No scars, no marks, nothing remained on my hands or feet. The same doctors who had examined me for years could hardly believe what they were seeing. For half a century, the wounds had remained open, and now they had vanished as mysteriously as they had appeared. It was as if the mission had been completed. Just days later, on September 23, 1968, I celebrated Mass for the final time. My voice was weak, my body exhausted, but my heart was filled with peace. That night, In my small cell at the monastery, I prayed quietly, and as the night grew still, I spoke the final words that had guided my entire life. Jesus, Mary. With those words on my lips, my soul left this world. I was 81 years old. News of my death spread quickly. Within hours, thousands of people filled the streets of San Giovanni Rotondo. They came from nearby villages, from distant cities, and from countries far beyond Italy. Many of them wept, not because a miracle worker had died, but because they believed they had lost a spiritual father. But my story did not end there. Years later, after careful investigation into my life, my works, and the countless testimonies of those who had encountered God through my ministry, the Church officially recognized what many already believed. In 2002, Pope John Paul II declared me a saint of the Catholic Church. Today the world knows me as Padre Pio of Pietrelcina. Yet, if you remember anything about my story, remember this: the wounds, the miracles, the mysteries, they were never the most important part. The most important thing was always faith. Pray, trust in God, and never lose hope, even in the darkest moments of your life. Because sometimes, the greatest miracles are not the ones we see with our eyes, but the ones that quietly transform the human heart. And if this story moved you, take a moment to subscribe to the channel and continue exploring the lives of the saints, because their stories remind us that holiness is not just history. It is a path that is still open for every soul today.